So welcome everyone. I'd say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome. Um, Robert Sapolsky, it's a delight, really an absolute delight to welcome him to be our first speaker and inaugural speaker to launch our webinar series. Some facts about Dr. Sapolsky that you may or may not know. One of them is that he spent a good part of his career in Kenya and in Uganda and Tanzania, but in Kenya in particular. And he used to come to Kenya and camp under the same tree for 30 years, and thereby observing the baboons and other animals and interactions, and really changed our perspective of interpreting different kinds of stressors and how the genesis of allostatic load and how we can explain the neuroscience of research. He significantly advanced the field of stress research, as I said, and like to welcome him to Nairobi one day soon. His observations have been really transformative, and I'm sure you know that because about 1,800 of you have registered in the webinar today, which is unusual for us. It is really tells me that you can't get a more well-known person in this domain than Dr. Sapolsky. He is, in addition to all you know about him, I must say that he's not only a renowned researcher, but he's also a philosopher. He is an author of many books, including the one that's entitled, that you may know about, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which always put a smile on my face. And he's also an advisor to the National Museum of Kenya. So he's a multi-talented, multi-engaged individual. But last but not least, I would like to say that he is a true humanitarian. He is looking to change our understanding of the world and our interventions to improve the well-being of people all through the globe. So Bwana Sapolsky, karibu sana. He speaks Swahili because he spent enough time there. Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, Zul. Thank you, Kendi. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here, wherever here is, in our virtual world. But I most certainly wish I were actually in person in Nairobi, one of my favorite places out there, except for the traffic. But it's such a remarkable pleasure seeing that the Aga Khan University. I well know the hospital there in Parkland, seeing how it is expanded to an entire university there that cares about neuroscience, and that's wonderful to see. Now, let me start off with a scenario that's entirely imaginary, but it is 100 million years ago, and we're considering some dinosaur. I don't know if it's a herbivore or predator, but some dinosaur who is being menaced by some other high-ranking dinosaur, and the larger one is threatening him. And remarkably, amazingly, 100 million years ago, this poor stressed dinosaur is going to be secreting the exact same class of stress-related molecules that you do when you think about global warming, when you think about abstractions, when you think about everyday stressors, class of steroid hormones, glucocorticoids, and almost certainly from everything we can tell, this is a class of hormones, this is a part of the stress response that's been around for 100 million, 150 million years or so. And remarkably, when you get stressed, you are activating the identical physiology as would any other primate, or a fish, or a bird, or a reptile, or a dinosaur from back when. This is an incredibly conserved piece of our physiology. And this is for a very logical reason until you get to us, we humans, and the strange ways in which we get stressed. The starting point is, this makes perfect logic if you are a normal animal. If you were a normal social beast, in a scene I know well from my time in Masai Mara, if you are an organism who is in immediate crisis, someone is very intent on eating you, You are very intent on eating someone else, or you are not going to survive the night. And what we see in these cases is we are dealing with the classical stress response. In both those organisms, they are secreting glucocorticoids, they are activating their sympathetic nervous system, and they are doing virtually identical things in their body as would that dinosaur have been doing, and as would you if you were running away from a predator. Above all else, what you're doing with the starts of your stress response is you're mobilizing energy. You're delivering energy where it's needed to your thigh muscles that are running you across the savanna. The very first steps of the endocrine stress response are you shut down energy storage, you shut down metabolism throughout the body in order to pour glucose into the bloodstream from your liver and deliver it to whichever muscles are going to save your life. Also, whether you are that gazelle or that cheetah, what you're going to be doing is increasing your cardiovascular tone. Your heart's going to be beating faster, your blood pressure, your breathing rate, all is part of the strategy. Get that oxygen, get that glucose to your thigh muscles in 2 seconds instead of 3, and you're that much more likely to survive. Now, another characteristic or set of characteristics of the stress response are shown in the following. You're running for your life. There's a predator right behind you. This is no time to be wasting energy on digestion. If you're trying to avoid being somebody's lunch, you don't worry about digesting breakfast. A characteristic of the stress response is you shut down the digestive tract. Do it later if there is a later. The energy you are mobilizing right now, you are doing so in the course of seconds from your liver and fat cells. Digestion takes hours. It's a slow, expensive process. This is no time for it. In addition, while you are running away from a predator, this is no time to be putting calcium in your long bones or building antlers or some such thing. You shut down growth. You shut down reproduction. You shut down all of these processes, which are expensive and future-oriented and optimistic, so that you are using your energy to survive the next 2 minutes. Finally, with the onset of stress, you enhance your immune defenses. And this makes perfect sense. If you were injured at that point, to suppress inflammation that it would make difficult to use your joints and your legs while you're running, all of that. Collectively, we've got a very logical stress response for most organisms over the last 100 million years, which is you're mobilizing energy, you're delivering where it's needed, and you're turning off unessentials. And interestingly, you're also doing stuff in your brain. Your sensory thresholds are sharpening, your cognition is better. All of this is extremely adaptive. And basically, whether you are a gazelle or a cheetah and you try to have one of these highly stressful sort of crises, and you try to do it without turning on this physiological stress response, and you're going to die of cardiac arrest in about 30 seconds or so. So we have our first critical point here, which is if you are a normal organism, you had better be able to turn on the stress response when you are stressed. But then we get to us. We complex social primates, we complex species with psychosocial stress, all of that. And we see this critical contrast, which is you sit there on a Uhuru highway in horrible traffic in the morning, and you are activating the same exact stress response as would those animals on the savannah. And the punchline of all of stress physiology is when you are smart enough of a primate to turn it on for purely psychological reasons, as we do when we think about geopolitics and traffic jams and relationships and money worries and all of that. If you were doing that, if you were turning on this 100 million year old stress response and you're not using it to run across the savannah, and instead to sit there and feel anxious or depressed or worried, the punchline of the entire field is that's not what the stress response evolved for. For 99% of the beasts on this planet, stress is about an acute physical crisis. And then we go and turn on the exact same thing, thinking about whether the planet's going to be there by the time we're elderly. We turn it on for purely psychological reasons. And what you see as a result is an enormously increased risk of pathology. On the metabolic level, 30 seconds, you're running away from a predator. You mobilize energy by blocking energy storage. That's great. That saves your life. Do it chronically. You are getting all sorts of obesity being more likely to happen, insulin-resistant diabetes, adult onset diabetes, all of these disasters. Go running for your life for 30 seconds and your blood pressure is incredibly elevated. That's not because you were suffering from high blood pressure. It's because you were saving your life. Do that chronically. You were suffering from stress-induced hypertension, increased risk of atherosclerosis, cerebrovascular disease, all sorts of things like that. Chronically shut down digestion, and you were more at risk for an ulcer in an interaction with this class of bacteria called Helicobacter that causes ulcers. Stress potentiates the effects of this bacteria. Growth. If you were a child and you were chronically stressed, you will impair growth. This phenomenon of psychosocial dwarfism, kids who stop growing for reasons of purely psychological stress. We see disruption of reproduction. If you were a female mammal, cycles become irregular. They stop altogether. Stress-induced amenorrhea, erectile dysfunction in males. And with sustained stress, that immune effects of 30 seconds of running for your life turn into immune suppression, chronic inflammation. So we've got the other half of our double-edged sword here on the left. If you were going to get stressed like a normal animal, you'd better turn on the stress response. On the right, if you were going to get stressed by a psychosocially complicated species like being a human, worrying and suffering trauma and loss, you would better be able to turn off the stress response as much as possible, because a large percentage of leading causes of non-infectious disease related sort of pathology are made worse by chronic stress. Now, what I've left off the list here, looking at metabolic disorders, cardiovascular, immune-related, all of that, is the area that I spent all of my time thinking about, which is, so what's going on in the brain when you are contrasting short-term stress with chronic stress? And the basic response, the basic answer is everything goes wrong in the brain when it is chronic. Short-term, the stress response is fantastic in the brain. Concentration is focused. Your sensory thresholds are lower. You are more attuned to sounds, to views, sights, all of that. Your memory consolidation is enhanced. Flashbulb memory, where you will remember that event for the rest of your life. Short term, the stress response is fantastic. You increase glucose delivery and oxygen to the brain. You increase synaptic plasticity in places like the hippocampus, this wonderful picture. And it's not until you are chronically stressed, chronically, like for the last 6 hours or for the last 60 years, that you see this transition to everything going on in your brain is instead deleterious. Now, where we got our first hints of what could go wrong was in the hippocampus. And this was work started in the 1980s, myself and others basically showing in the face of chronic stress, in the face of chronic exposure to glucocorticoids, you damage the hippocampus. You impair its function, you decrease synaptic plasticity, dendritic processes disconnect from each other, you sort of disconnect neural circuitry there. At an extreme, you will kill neurons in a hippocampus. With enough chronic stress, you inhibit adult neurogenesis. And what you see here is this picture we've now recognized for 40 years or so, which is chronic stress disrupts cognition, damages the hippocampus, damages the sort of memory and learning that the hippocampus specializes in. And we all know this. If you have just spent the entire night up preparing for a talk, and now in the morning you were stressed and sleep deprived, you're barely going to remember your name, let alone what you're supposed to say next. You are seeing the consequences of stress in the hippocampus. And one of the most persistent effects of this chronic stress there is the actual overall volume of the hippocampus will decrease hippocampal atrophy. This has now been shown in two very, very meaningful circumstances in humans. People with long-term post-traumatic stress disorder, you have atrophy of the hippocampus. People with long-term major depression, atrophy of the hippocampus. And in both cases, it is as a function of the severity of the trauma, the severity and the chronicity of the depression. And we have here glucocorticoids pounding away at the hippocampus. And in both of those cases, you see exactly the sort of cognitive problems you would expect with a hippocampus that's not working very well. And my lab spent 30 years exploring the molecular biology of how everything on this chart occurs. How is chronic stress making your hippocampus work a whole lot less well than it's supposed to? Now, the next outlet that people then began to appreciate was the amygdala, sitting right next door to the hippocampus, and a very different picture happening there. The amygdala, not involved in learning and memory, the amygdala involved in fear, in anxiety, in aggression, things of that sort. And what you see in the amygdala is the exact opposite picture. While glucocorticoids and stress are decreasing hippocampal function, in the amygdala, they are making the amygdala work better than it is supposed to. It becomes hyperexcitable. You increase synaptic plasticity. You increase the number of dendritic spines, the complexity of the circuitry. You increase the overall volume of the amygdala during chronic stress. And this is shown likewise in post-traumatic stress disorder. The amygdala gets bigger. What are we describing here? This part of the brain that's working better than it should. Whoa, who wouldn't want their brain to work better than usual? What are we describing here? The disaster that this is why chronic stress increases the likelihood of anxiety disorders and fear disorders, and it making easier to learn a conditioned association of something that is stressful and frightening, makes it harder to unlearn that. All of this is due to the fact that stress and glucocorticoids working at a level we understand down to molecules and gene regulation is making the amygdala just begging to become afraid and anxious about more things than would normally be the case. So this is certainly bad news. At that point, by around the 1990s or so, attention then began to focus on the dopamine system in the brain. Dopamine, neurotransmitter, what everyone is associating dopamine with is pleasure. It's the neurotransmitter that euphoriant drugs like cocaine work on. Dopamine is about pleasure. Much more than that, it turns out dopamine is much more about the anticipation of pleasure, the motivation to perform the behaviors, the work necessary to obtain those pleasures. And much of this has to do with what is termed the mesolimbic and the mesocortical dopamine system in the brain, involving the ventral tegmentum, the nucleus accumbens, all of that. And what is chronic stress? What are chronic glucocorticoids doing there? Something very simple and straightforward. If chronic enough, it's depleting that system of dopamine. What have we just explained? Absolutely clearly why chronic stress makes it hard to feel pleasure, hard to feel anticipation, hard to feel motivation, anhedonia. What have we just described here? This is the link between chronic stress and trauma and an increased risk of depressive disorders. Now, at that point, attention began to focus on what's one of the most interesting outposts in the brain, the frontal cortex. The frontal cortex, it's the most recently evolved part of our brain. We have proportionally more of it than any other species out there. What is the frontal cortex good for? Long-term planning, gratification postponement, emotional regulation, impulse control. If you were tempted to do something rash and stupid and impulsive, and you manage to stop yourself at the last second from doing that, it's because you have a frontal cortex that is working well. And what are the effects of chronic stress there? Exactly the same as in the hippocampus, exactly for the same underlying mechanisms. Chronic stress, chronic glucocorticoids, and your frontal cortex does not work as well. Synaptic plasticity decreases, there's atrophy of circuitry, there's thinning out of cortical layers. What are we beginning to describe here? This is why when you were chronically stressed, you make terrible decisions. Your executive function is impaired. Your ability to regulate your emotions is impaired. Your ability to control damaging impulses. This is the neurobiology of why during periods of extreme stress, we make terrible decisions and we make terrible choices that appear brilliant at the time, and you regret it for the rest of your life. Now, what we seem to have collectively here is this terrible picture of chronic stress impairing cognition by way of the hippocampus, increasing the risk of anxiety disorders by way of the amygdala, increasing the risk of mood affective disorders like depression by way of the dopamine system, disrupting judgment, impulse control, all of that by way of the frontal cortex. Now, this seems plenty depressing enough as a quartet of effects in the brain. In very recent years, we're getting one additional outpost that we're beginning to appreciate just how damaging that could be. And this is in a part of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. What's the anterior cingulate about? People used to think it was a very straightforward answer, which is part of the network, the circuitry in your brain that processes pain. Someone pokes your finger with a pin, and parts of your brain will activate telling you it's your finger and not your foot. Parts of your hindbrain will be telling you that's a sharp pain and not an abrasive chronic one. Parts of your brain, what is the anterior cingulate telling you? This is upsetting. This is bad. This is something you would like to avoid. This is something painful. The anterior cingulate supplies the interpretive information, the interpretive perspective that you bring to pain. Okay, that's great. Now we have somebody in the brain scanner and we do the experiment a little bit differently. Do not poke their finger with a pin. Instead, make them watch their loved one having their finger poked with a pin. And amazingly, the anterior cingulate activates. It's the part of the brain where you were feeling somebody else's pain. For a neuron in the anterior cingulate, it could not tell the difference between your pain and the pain of someone who matters to you. It is the part of the brain that is most central to empathy, to perspective taking, to feeling somebody else's pain. And what very recent research has done, some of it out of my group, a lot from other labs as well, has shown something that we are very familiar with, which is during periods of stress, not only does your memory get bad and you get depressed and you make stupid judgments and all of that, but it's harder to feel empathy for somebody else. It's harder to feel somebody else's pain. And what our research shows is this has lots to do with glucocorticoids working in the anterior cingulate. And in this particular paper, we showed both in lab rats and in college freshmen who volunteered for this, if you give them a drug that blocks glucocorticoid actions, you enhance empathy. You enhance the capacity to respond to somebody else's pain. Now, what I think this brings us to at the end here is when we look at a world full of stress and trauma and pain and uncertainty and pandemics and waves of refugees fleeing conflict and waves of people whose lives are being threatened by global warming, all of that, We are seeing a world of people who neurobiologically are not thinking at their best and are more vulnerable to certain psychiatric diseases. And their judgment is not great. But I think what we're seeing most importantly is when we are chronically stressed, when we are in a world full of people who are chronically stressed, this is the neurobiology of why it becomes harder to think about somebody else instead of just about you and people who look like you and people who pray like you, and to become very focused and narrow. This is the neurobiology of why trauma and stress can bring out the worst in us instead of the best in us. Okay, so at this point, I would like to stop so we can transition to the next speakers, and I am eager to hear their perspectives. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think I know many people like I were writing copious notes. Very interesting, and it will be interesting to explore some of the facts that you shared, Professor Sapolsky. Now I would like to invite Dr. Boniface Chitai, who is the president of the Kenya Psychiatric Association. Please go ahead, Dr. Chitai.
Yes, thank you very much for that welcome. And thank you, Professor Sapolsky, for that presentation. So I will briefly discuss the African perspective to stress and trauma. And just to start us off, our continent of Africa has suffered from multiple traumatic events, some historical, others contemporary, and others both. Some of these historical events that have been traumatic include wars. Some of these wars were waged during the colonial period as many different African communities resisted colonialism or colonization. And there were wars in Tanzania, wars in Kenya and West Africa, and many other different places. Post-colonially, we have also suffered from a lot of tragedies, including civil wars. Of note, of course, is the Biafran War of Nigeria in the 1960s, where more than 200,000 people or thereabout lost their lives, and millions, up to 3 million people were displaced as refugees or internally. We've also had wars in Rwanda, in Somalia, in Sudan, Liberia, northern Uganda, and many other different countries. In the last 20 years, our continent and of note, my country of Kenya has suffered from a lot of terrorist attacks, sort of which have been increasing since 1998 when there was a bomb blast attack in the CBD of Nairobi. Then we've had Westgate attack in 2013, Garissa University attack, Dusit D2 hotel attack in 2019. Uganda has also suffered from a major terrorist attack in 2010. Remember, during the World Cup, Soccer World Cup finals, and some of the violence, or trauma has come from political leadership or sometimes coup d'etats, authoritarian rule, and also elections. So, for instance, Kenya suffered a major post-election period of upheaval in 2007, 2008. Luckily, Kenya just came from an election that had a bit of tension, but was largely peaceful. So at the moment, we've been spared the worst after this election, and we are very happy about this peaceful transition. However, of all these traumatic events, what we know is that a lot of times, while we count the dead, but it leaves behind a trail of destruction that is traumatic, such as displacement of people, separation of families, physical injuries. There is the aspect of starvation, there are abductions, there's sexual abuse, there's disruption of the social services, there's emotional and psychological pain. And of course, listening to Professor Sapolsky, we know that these events then have an effect on the brain, and therefore studies have shown that, for example, among refugees, up to 50% of refugees suffer from mental disorders such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And studies that have been done among internally displaced persons, for instance, in Darfur, in 2010 showed that up to 54% of persons living in the internally displaced camps suffered from PTSD. In Nigeria as well, following the 2011 post-election violence in Nigeria, up to 42.2% of internally displaced persons suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. While in my own country of Kenya, there was noted increased rate of PTSD and substance use among the population that lived in the affected areas. And this was about 5 years later in 2013. So we can see, and up to now, myself as a practitioner, I still meet persons who are still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder that followed the 2007-2008 violence. Studies also in camps, for example, in Naivasha, IDP camp in 2009, showed that all the women in the internally displaced camp in Naivasha suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. So very high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in these camps. And when you look at other disorders such as depression, a study of the Melkadida camp in eastern Ethiopia that mostly had Somali refugees showed rates of 38.3% of depression. So these rates of both depression and post-traumatic stress disorder are much higher than the general population. For instance, in Kenya, the rate of PTSD in the population is in the range of 10.6%, while the rate of depression is in the range of 12%. So what do survivors of these traumatic events must find ways of coping, and how do they cope? One is the traditional versus spiritual mode of coping with stress. So a good number of people in my country, Kenya, and around Africa are either Christians or Muslims, and some of them subscribe to traditional beliefs. So people tend to turn to these during periods of trauma. We also have the arts, music, poetry. Poetry is very common during times of wars. One of the famous poems called "The Casualties," by some gentleman called Pepper, John Pepper, highlighted the effects of the Biafran War on the population. We also have Western medical interventions, which include pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. So, but as I conclude, there are many literary works, a lot of literature that actually speaks to narratives around trauma on our continent, and it's important to do highlight this. And one good analysis has been made from the year 2000 to 2014 by a gentleman called Nick Ndika, who has highlighted some of the literary works that have been written around trauma from different countries around Eastern Africa. So really, the perspective here from East Africa and Africa is that persons living on our continent have been victims of traumatic events that range from wars, political election-related violence, terrorism, and natural calamities, and that these events predispose them, the survivors, to mental health challenges, predominantly major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And strategies used to cope with traumatic events include spiritual approaches, prayer fellowship, arts, music, literature, poetry, and conventional Western medicine, such as psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, which, needless to say, is often in limited supply, or the access is not that great. But one silver lining on the cloud in my own country is that there's good progress, especially with regards to policy. We have a mental health policy. We have a suicide prevention strategy at the moment, and currently we are trying to have decriminalization of suicide attempt in Kenya. Thank you.
Before Sapolsky comments, maybe we can listen to Dr. Das, Dr. Jawad Akbar Das, who is a consultant psychiatrist from the Department of Psychiatry, Jinnah Postgraduate Medical Center. And we'll give you your time and then we'll allow for a bit more robust conversation. Thank you, Dr. Das.
Thank you, Candy. Thank you so much. And I would say a great initiative by Dr. Zoor Marali and Dr. Chitai, you have covered very well. I would say that Professor Sapolsky has wonderfully covered the hormones and brain anatomy and how it's affected by the stress. I'll mainly cover the South Asian aspect, as I was mentioned. And South Asian aspect, I would say that South Asian part is very important because the significant world's population lives in this area. I would say that. And most of the countries are from low and middle income, and we are well aware that there is an enormous burden of mental health disorders in low and middle income countries. And adding to the complicating the picture further is with the fact that almost 80 to 85% of the sufferer who are facing this mental health disorders, they don't get proper treatment or a complete treatment, I would say that. That makes a huge number. So with these numbers, we can infer that the direct and indirect consequences of stress in the population with a multitude of factors contributing to overall effect. However, there are certain factors which are specific or unique to this population. That is underdeveloped countries that are in low and middle income countries, I would say, economic disparity, socio-political conflict, lack of adequate resources, and more recently, this COVID pandemic. And adding to this is the drastic impact of climate crisis that we are recently facing in the shape of this flooding. So with all these factors and with this limited time, I would say that I have tried to cover just two areas which are, to me, are the vulnerable, which makes the population vulnerable to this stress. And out of this, number one is socioeconomic status. There have been many researches, many reports discussed how vulnerability to the stress was shaped by socioeconomic status, with those in lower socioeconomic categories typically experiencing the most severe stress, be it a farmer in the rural population or a person with job instability and deaths in the urban population. So the poverty and resource insecurity came out to be the most common cause of stress in our part. This included not only lack of money, I would say that, however, the facilities, the simple, basic facilities of sanitation or hygiene, personal hygiene, toileting, and even water insecurity that makes it even worse. So in several studies, people even explicitly stated that no form of mental health initiative or intervention would work because they believe that stress is the result of their poverty and therefore only structural intervention could improve the situation. Now, when I heard this Professor Sapolsky that the prefrontal cortex, which is affected and which is resulting in planning and failure or difficulty in planning, so this is very, very well related to this. The second most important vulnerable factor, that second and last, I would say that, is the gender inequality. Half of our population comprises of women, and I would say that they are the marginalized sector in this part, with chronic abuse, be it physical, psychological, or even financial abuse from husbands or the family members is a frequent theme. There have been many publications on this area. Women have been described as, often described, the rigid gender norm they have to face in the face of like giving birth to son And even in case of employment of the woman, the conflict between domestic and the job obligation that even results in this stress. As far as the men or man population is concerned, they are, when they face the stress, is mostly on the economic burdens that they face, especially the pressures being financial provider for their families under these conditions of poverty. So when it comes to expression of this stress, usually somatization remained the common in this part and the socially acceptable way to express their stress in symptoms like insomnia, GI upset, fatigue, or perceived low blood pressure. These are the main things that they present with. And when this external stress, or I would say the demands increases, this trajectory goes down to depressive disorder or even substance misuse and self-harm. So in concluding all this, I would say that I will take the opportunity of this session and I would congratulate Dr. Zul for arranging this so that we can raise the awareness and focus on the ways which can effectively address the challenges to help us in finding solution for both short and long term. Thank you so much.
I will pass the mic to Dr. Sapolsky because he's been contemplating about some of those very same issues for a period of time and has got some very interesting ideas and constructs of how the societies evolve and how do we get into conflict and how do we get out of this quagmire, all triggered by chronic stressors. And so I'll pass it on to Dr. Sapolsky to see what his thoughts are on that front.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Doctors Chitai and Dawes. You've elucidated wonderfully exactly the problems we are facing. And in places in East Africa that have had histories of considerable trauma, and places where climate challenges are becoming more disastrous in all these places, I think one of the key points that was hit on is everything goes worse if you were in a society with inequality, with socioeconomic disparities, all of that was emphasized there. And I think in terms of Zul, sort of the logo for the whole institute, from neuron to neighborhood, that's where you make a critical leap. In a world in which stress hormones are making for brains that are prone towards anxiety and depression and learning problems, all of that, what that is also doing is making this a world that is prone towards poor social capital, poor supportiveness, poor trust in a community, poor sense of collective efficacy. And what is seen is, what one can spend your life thinking about as a neurobiologist, what stress hormones are doing to this neuron's, transcription factors, played out at a large level. It's why unequal worlds are violent worlds, are hostile worlds, are psychiatrically challenged worlds, all of that, because in a world that's unequal, in a world that is hierarchical, the more there's the layers as to those above you and those below you, the more you are alone. The more you have a lack of peers, you have a lack of social support. This seems incredibly important in that regard. And I think this is where we see playing out how you go from like unhealthy neurons to unhealthy societies, and unhealthy societies where people have a lot of trouble feeling for somebody else. And this is exactly the linkage. So I'm really glad this was emphasized.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's very profound. Kendi, are there questions on the chat line that you would like to highlight?
Sure. Yes, there are. I will actually just quickly present them so that it's just easier that way. 1 second. And so from from Muhammad Imran, he asks, is there any genetic linkage of Parkinson's with stress and anxiety? And maybe we can start off with you, Sapolsky, and then we can hear other thoughts from the rest of the panel.
Let's see, we're increasingly understanding that there are links between chronic stress and risk of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and such. Fortunately, there's not a strong link, or any that I know of, in terms of being a risk factor for Parkinson's disease. The commonality, one might think, is chronic stress, depletion of dopamine, anhedonia, depression, all of that. Parkinson's disease, depletion of dopamine, loss of dopamine releasing neurons in the substantia nigra. Fortunately, unfortunately, these are two very different systems. And the stress-induced depletion in the limbic dopamine system is not going on in the areas that are hit in Parkinson's. What is relevant, though, is chronic stress changes people's lifestyles, and usually not for the better, and usually for the worse. And some of the risk factors that we understand now that increase the risk of Parkinson's are risk factors that become more common when we are chronically stressed. So neurobiologically, there's not particularly a link. In terms of the effects of stress on behavior and risk factors, there most definitely is a link.
I'll agree with the professor, and as it has been mentioned that stress doesn't leave any part of your body going haywire. So I believe maybe we are not aware of it at this moment, but someday we will see there is a link between this.
So briefly, from my end, I would also think that there's no direct link, certainly not genetic, but looking at maybe a link between stress and a similar chronic illness, perhaps I would think of a link between chronic stress and Alzheimer's dementia. I wonder what Prof may want to say, but given the impact of stress on the hippocampus and similar pathology would be such a link.
Well, this is a linkage that people used to be skeptical about, but is becoming more and more solid. And, as someone who is older than I used to be, this is absolutely terrifying, but it makes a great deal of sense. As Dr. Chitaya just emphasized, the two areas most damaged in Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. And as we saw, the two areas of the brain most vulnerable to damage with chronic stress, hippocampus and frontal cortex. Almost certainly, chronic stress is a contributor to Alzheimer's risk. It's not a major factor, however. If you have a choice between being chronically stressed for years or having repeated concussive head traumas, the latter is more likely to give you Alzheimer's disease, but nonetheless, that's a contributing factor. And once you have a dementia, chronic stress certainly accelerates the rate of decline because the biology, the neurobiology of the two are definitely interacting. So that's a domain that's extremely relevant for our aging populations, including me.
Thank you. There's a question from Dr. Shejad, who's asking, what is the link between stressors and diabetes, for example?
Okay, in terms of a linkage, I'll assume the questioner is referring to type 2 diabetes, the insulin-resistant kind, and there's an extremely strong connection. So you are running for your life, activating a stress response. What do you want to be doing? Mobilizing energy to your muscles, all of that. What do you also want to be doing? Don't be wasting your energy, taking it up into your fat cells, taking it up into your organs, all of that. As a starting point of the stress response, you inhibit glucose uptake throughout the body, except for exercising muscles. And one of the ways you do that is you induce insulin resistance in target cells. glucocorticoids act genomically to cause translocation of insulin receptors off the cell surface in various fat cells and such. What are you doing? You are taking a disease, insulin-resistant diabetes, where your body is having more and more trouble responding to insulin, and thus leaving more and more glucose in your bloodstream to cause damage. And all that stress does is say, what a brilliant idea that is to stop listening to insulin, make it even more extreme. And stress absolutely exacerbates the severity of insulin resistance and diabetes, and it increases the risk of it. And given that, adult onset diabetes is a disease that none of our great-great-grandparents had to think about, but it's becoming an epidemic in the world, this is a very important linkage.
Absolutely. And like the rate of obesity going up, I think ties pretty well to that, because I think that you have the energy utilization has been damaged, and and you have weight gain that is becoming almost epidemic now. And so there is, in my mind, a good link, very strong link between stressors and obesity, because at one point they were considered very different disorders. And so I think that there is a lot of connections of your physical well-being and metabolic syndrome, things like that coming into play. Thank you very much, Professor Sapolsky, for taking the time. We really appreciate your reflections on this topic. Stress and mental illness is very topical here in the developing countries, where there are so many forms of stressors. We didn't even talk about things like HIV that is continues giving a continued stress to the communities with the loss of their generation of parents and things like that. So we're particularly prone to many types of stressors, and it impacts our well-being, mental well-being. And so the idea is that as we learn more, we will be able to find solutions that might be more relevant to our populations, because sometimes solutions that come from abroad don't always work too well in our geographies. So we're hoping that this webinar series will allow people to get a better understanding, not only about what mental illnesses look like, but in essence, what are some of the underpinnings, so that we can begin to have some modifiable risk factors that we can address in our communities. So also thank you to the panelists for taking the time, and all those that are attending the webinar. Thank you so much. I hope you gained a lot of insights. And last but not least, I wanted to say a special thank you to Candy and Gloria and Shiru and the team, because without their support, it would be very difficult to launch a webinar like this, which is really multi-country and such a high volume of attendance. So thank you all, and best of luck. And hopefully, Professor Sapolsky, we'll see you soon in Kenya.